Hey, it's Dean DiMarzo here on Longest Solo Ever with 4 tips for getting the most out of your one-shot drum samples. So, recording live drums is one of the trickiest things to get right. You've usually got a dozen different microphones, you're trying to keep them all in phase with each other, get the levels just right, and on top of that you gotta make sure the drums themselves sound good. Overall, it can just be a really tricky and frustrating process. Something that helps a lot is augmenting those live drums with drum samples. Now there's 2 main kinds of drum samples out there. You've got your fully featured drum kits that can basically replace an entire drum set and have multiple different samples for each drum. 100 different, slightly different snare drum hits for that perfect realism. And then on the other hand, you have what are called one-shot samples. It's literally just a single, simple, straightforward, awesome sounding drum sound that you use to augment the live drum sound you already have. Now, in a lot of cases for working with live drums, I think this is the better option for a few reasons that I'm going to go into in a moment. Today we'll be using a collection of samples called Drumshotz Joey Sturgis. It's a really cool collection of just absolutely huge drum hits by Joey Sturgis, who's an awesome music producer and educator. I've already done a video on my whole drum replacing workflow from start to finish. If you want to check that out, I'll link that in the description below. Today, I'm just offering 4 guidelines I use to get the most out of these drum samples. Today, we're going to be working with a track called Reaction, which I mixed for a band called Adesta a few years back. So I'll definitely link that in the description below. If you like what you hear, you should definitely check it out. It's awesome. I'm not just saying that because I mixed it. Here's a quick listen before we had drum samples on it. And that's pretty good. We got a great drum sound right out of the gate. These samples are just there to augment and clarify the drumming that's already there. You can see it really does just clarify the great drum sound we already had. So let's dive in and take a look at my 4 tips for getting the most out of your one-shot drum samples. First up, do it yourself. There are a lot of plugins and pieces of software out there that'll try to take the waveform you feed in and figure out where exactly you hit the drum and convert it into MIDI. This can be really useful in a lot of cases. I was using programs like these back when I was using just drum triggers for all my drum sounds. If you look in all my old videos, there's no actual mics on the drums, just these little red drum triggers. And I got some great sounds with that. But for augmenting existing drum sounds, I really don't recommend using these. These programs can be a little inconsistent with where exactly they place the drum sample in relation to the actual hit. If it places the drum sample just a little bit ahead or behind of your hit, we can end up with all kinds of phase issues, these weird kind of flam effects, all things we want to avoid if we're going for a clear, consistent drum sound. For that reason, I opt to always place my drum samples by hand. It's a little bit more time consuming, and I really mean a little bit. It's really quick once you get the hang of it. But it is absolutely worth it to do it by hand rather than relying on a triggering program. My second piece of advice is to match phase with the original drum track you'll be mixing it with. This sounds obvious once I say it, but it may not occur to you if you're not manually placing these at the waveform level. So when I place drum samples manually, I take advantage of Pro Tools' Tab to Transient feature. It looks like this. By pressing Tab, my cursor moves through the waveform until it comes to the next big transient, the next big bump. And when I reach that, I paste in my sample. In this case, I'm using Snare Smack from Drumshotz Joey Sturgis, which sounds like this. It's got a nice smack to it. I'll speed up the placement of the rest of these samples just to save us some time here. And let's take a listen to how that turned out with our original snare track balanced in. Now that sounded pretty good, but I heard some inconsistencies in the snare tone. This is because not every one of the samples landed exactly on the hit. This is the same problem we'd run into when triggering something. Because I relied so much on Pro Tools' tab to transient function, we ended up with some inconsistent placement. So what I always do as a second step, I'm going to turn off tab to transient. Now it'll just tab to the next region no matter where I am. I'm going to zoom in really close and just zoom in on these two tracks. So now I have my original snare top track and my sample. And all I'm going to do is drag them until they match each other. And see, now that I've got this placed correctly, these two are in perfect sync with each other. They're even perfectly in phase for the first few cycles of the waveform. That's great. That means they're going to be working with each other instead of against each other in producing a great drum tone. So I'm going to go through each of these placements one by one. Look how far off this one is. That's producing one of those kind of flams. I'm just tabbing through each of these regions until I get them all lined up just right. And there we go. Now there's one thing I missed in there when I was placing these samples. I didn't get the length of this sample just right. We're going to fix that. Just going to drag this one forward. Now I want to be extra careful that I'm not clipping the transient of this next sample or we end up with this. Not great. So I pull this one forward and then I pull the other one back to the very beginning of its clip. Now that we've gotten the placement just right, let's take a listen to this with and without our drum sample. Here's with. And without. Tip number 3 is to let the original drum tracks take the lead in the mix. One-shot drum samples sound awesome. They sound perfect. That's part of the problem. When you have a single perfect drum hit hitting over and over again, you can get what's called the machine gun effect. There's no natural variation in the same sample hitting over and over again. Now, I mentioned before those drum packages that have a million different hits that do vary just slightly, but the problem is we're augmenting a real drummer with these samples. If we take a bunch of naturally varying drum samples in one of these MIDI drum kits and mix it with a naturally varying drum hit from a real drummer in our live track, we get really inconsistent sound. The best results we can get are mixing really consistent, awesome one-shots with really great live drumming that has natural variations. But we've got to let those natural variations take the lead. I try to bring the drum sample down in the mix to the point where I can just barely tell it's still there. Then I bring it back up a bit from there to get some more of the tone. I'll show you an example by mixing a little bit of the drum samples we just dropped in the verse. So that's the point where I can just barely tell it's there. We're going to bring it back up a bit from there to get the effect of the one shot, and I think we'll be good. I think that's just perfect. You can hear on those two quick hits, we still have some natural variation. On the other hand, if I was to lead with the sample, it would stick out a little bit more there. Let's try that. You can hear how inhuman that sounds. It's an awesome, awesome snare tone, but it doesn't sound like it actually happened in the room. That still sounds totally natural, but it's still being improved by the sample we dropped in. Just for comparison, we'll take the sample out and in a couple times and hear that quick hit. Here's without. And with. That sounds a million times better to me. My last piece of advice is don't be afraid to mix and match samples throughout a song. You don't have to commit to one snare drum sound in a song. This may be kind of breaking outside the rules of what can naturally happen during a song recording, but just as there's no rules saying you couldn't switch out the snare drum you recorded for the verse for the one you record during the chorus, there's no saying we can't swap out which sample we're using in each of these cases, especially if it's a really different texture in the verse than it is in the chorus. We might need a different snare sample to do the job of the snare drum. And that's what happened in this song here. The verses are these really cool, kind of sparse, funky, Deftones kind of groove. So I opted for a really dry, clean, tight snare sample. In this case, it was, like I said, snare smack, the blended sample. For the choruses and the intro, I needed something with a little bit more space to it, something that had a little bit more body to the sound. So I went with the sample snare smash, again, the blended sample. Let's hear how that sounds in our intro and how it transitions to the snare sound we have in the verse. That still feels like a really natural transition to me. It doesn't feel like we've moved to a different room with a different drum set and a different drummer playing it. It just feels like the snare texture changed a little bit to suit what was happening around it. Using drum samples well, and using good drum samples, are one of the #1 things you can do to take your mix to the next level. Like I said in this video, I was using Drumshotz Joey Sturgis by Drumforge for all the samples you heard. I was also using it on the kick drum. I was using Kick Blow, the blended sample. Just for good measure, I'll play you the track with samples and without again to really hear the difference. Here's with. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Check out Drumforge Drumshotz Joey Sturgis. Check out Adesta. The song is called Reaction, and you can find it on their YouTube channel. I'll link that below as well. And if you like this video, please subscribe for more like this one. Give it a like, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below, and I'll get back to you soon there or in a future video. Again, thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.